This video is sponsored by Squarespace. Director George Miller is a fascinating figure in the history of cinema. From the mayhem and destruction in the world of Mad Max to the world of talking pigs and dancing penguins, it has been an incredibly eclectic career for the storied director, and is continuing on even today with the film Furiosa, a Mad Max story. But what is it that makes this director such an intriguing fixture in cinema? And through his stunning visuals, chaotic action sequences, and dark sensibilities, what message is he trying to convey to audiences? Such is the paradox of Miller's singular and sometimes singularly exasperating talent. He's got a great imagination, and he's willing to let it run away with him. Miller is an Australian born to a family of Greek immigrants in 1945. His path to the director's chair is an interesting one. Rather than studying film in school, he was actually a student of medicine, but film became a bit of a passion on the side for him, as he would slack off his university classes to go and watch the newest blockbusters, culminating in him dipping his toes into a short film.
I was always interested in drawing and painting when I was at university, and never dreamed I'd be making films. And then I won a short film competition just as I was finishing my medical studies. We were given 1 hour to make a 1-minute film in the camera, silent. And just to get away from my studies, I made this little film, and it won a film prize, and I ended up going to a film workshop, and then I kind of got hooked, and I started to edit little films.
After his time in the university, he joined film crews on more experimental short film projects, and then with a friend he had met at a film workshop, Byron Kennedy, he decided to make another short film, with the two pouring in $1,500 to bring their vision to life.
At this point, we need to decide whether this preoccupation with violence is necessarily unhealthy. And the question is an enormously complex one.
That film was the 14-minute Violence in Cinema, Part 1, showcasing a lecture by the main character, psychologist Dr. Edgar Finn, discussing the mass media's fascination with and focus on violence. All while Finn is violently attacked and attacks others. He gets his head blown off, he pokes someone's eye out with a hot poker, and then he gets run over and set on fire himself. There were of course real-life influences behind this. Miller's experiences in the medical sector gave him more exposure to violence than the average person, and Finn's speech was actually ripped straight from a real talk given to an audience of psychologists by writer Philip Adams. That same psychologist and critic was quick to critique Miller about Mad Max later in his career, saying in an article titled "The Dangerous Pornography of Death" that Dr. Miller's epic has all the moral uplift of Mein Kampf. But in Violence in Cinema Part 1, it's not overly clear the meaning of the film beyond pointed dark humor against censorship and the free expression of art.
Violence in the Cinema Part 1 was simply trying to make the point. The way we basically cerebrate something is quite different than the way we experience it viscerally. And quite often the struggle of humans, as humans, is to find some way to balance the two. And the more, if you like, higher brain function of ourselves, those two things were basically the struggle I think we always play out.
Later, he would remark that much of the violence and mayhem of all of his films was rooted in the bewilderment I felt at confronting the aftermath of violence.
At the time, there were these films. I remember Godfather 1 came out, Clockwork Orange, and there was the term ultra-violence in cinema came out in the early 80s. There were big censorship issues and so on, and that was in the air, and violence in the cinema came out of that. And I guess to some extent the first Mad Max, which a lot of people regard as very violent, probably had some of that influencing it as well.
Miller would go on to direct 2 more short films, St. Vincent's Revue film and The Devil in Evening Dress, before he and Byron decided to go all in on the movie business, forming a company called Kennedy Miller, with Kennedy as the producer and Miller as the director. Their first production under this label was a film far more people will recognize today.
Tomorrow, in a world gone mad, the only law will be a renegade squad of suicidal cops.
Mad Max was again heavily themed around violence, tapping into what Miller had witnessed in his medical schooling.
In retrospect, studying medicine was a big thing. You look at a human being, usually at a moment of extremis, close to death, in childbirth, or whatever. It's never a normal situation. So you're getting a very privileged perspective of other human beings. All of those things serve the filmmaking to an enormous degree.
Together with newspaper editor James McCausland, Miller crafted Mad Max's world, a post-apocalypse showing a version of Australia that was near lawless and run down by rampant violent crime, with motorcycle gangs claiming the outback, introducing a dystopian future theme to soften the blow, as it was believed that audiences would struggle to believe that the brutality Miller wanted to depict was going on in our world today.
You find a world in which you can play and work and hypothesize, and then you start finding strategies within that world to tell a story that seems to have authentic resonances. And your job is to make that world as persuasive as possible.
The character Max in the film is a police officer who ends up going rogue to enact vigilante justice for himself after losing family members and comrades to the gangs. McCausland used his knowledge of world politics to bring the apocalypse its environmentalist theme, looking to a period in the 1970s where fuel became expensive and scarce after oil-producing Arab countries decided to massively reduce production. Combined with localized strikes happening inside Australia itself, McCausland wrote that long queues formed at the stations with petrol, and anyone who tried to sneak ahead in the queue met raw violence. George and I wrote the script based on the thesis that people would do almost anything to keep vehicles moving, and the assumption that nations would not consider the huge costs of providing infrastructure for alternative energy until it was too late. This apocalyptic setting not only made the wanton destruction more plausible, but also helped with the low-budget nature of the film, with a budget of around $350,000, mostly raised from the donations of friends and family. So the scarcity of the world also helped with making it plausible to put together on the money side of things, as well as the world building. All that was really needed were some roadways, bikers, a car or two, and a few props here and there. Mad Max was a key example of guerrilla filmmaking. The crew would close roads and stage car crashes all without permission, with Miller and Byron sweeping up the debris afterwards to cover up their tracks.
It was so difficult. It's by far the most difficult film I've ever had to make. We had very little money and we had no experience, but we had enthusiasm and had really worked hard in its preparation.
Later, though, the Australian police did start to take interest in the film, not to crack down on their not-so-legal filmmaking techniques, but to give an unofficial helping hand, as the idea of what was essentially a futuristic cop story intrigued them. And while this film would receive a lot of criticism over the violence, as Philip Adams said it had all the moral uplift of Mein Kampf and said it would appeal to rapists, sadists, and child murderers, Miller had matured a bit as a filmmaker since his Violence in Cinema Part 1, and instead of outright showing violence in Mad Max, much of it was implied, which often has a longer lasting effect on the viewer and forces them to visualize it internally. The ramshackle production ended up paying off in the end as it roared with success, making hundreds of millions at the box office and even earning a Guinness World Record for the most profitable film of all time, a pedestal it would only be knocked off of with the release of The Blair Witch Project 2 decades later. Today's sponsor, Squarespace, has just been updated to Squarespace 7.1 with its powerful Fluid engine and newly added Blueprint AI and SEO tools. It's the easiest way to get a professional website for your business up and running for anyone who doesn't have a lot of time to, mess around with complicated coding. The new Blueprint AI system helps you build your website from the ground up, tailoring it to your specific business and industry. And instead of having to install a bunch of SEO plugins so people actually see your website, the new SEO tools will help you launch your site and get seen fast with integrated and optimized SEO tools that will help your website not get left behind in the dust. So head on over to squarespace.com for a free trial to test out their awesome new features. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/FrameVoyager to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain using the code FrameVoyager.
The first movie was really, for me, a very brutal experience in terms of creativity. I really thought I wasn't cut out to make movies.
Miller was feeling bitter about the film, baffled by its success and obsessing over its shortcomings, and he initially tried to take a break from the series.
All I see are the faults in it, but the great thing about it, it stopped me from getting arrogant and thinking I really understood it, because the truth of it is I felt very fraudulent.
After hiring the journalist Terry Hayes to help him put together a novelization of the film, he and Hayes set off for LA to work on a movie themed around rock and roll titled Roxanne, but this turned out to be a disaster. Roxanne ended up being shelved, and Miller and Hayes were disturbed by the American way of movie making. Hayes ended up describing Hollywood as an institutionalized form of conflict, where the writer fights to defend his work against the director fights the producer, and the producer fights the studio, compared what he saw as a more collaborative model in Australia. So he and Miller decided to pack up, go home, and give Mad Max another chance. Miller would speak to fellow directors and would rewatch favorite films of his from his icons just to come to terms with the fact that other filmmakers had come across the same struggles he had, going from the initial vision to the final result, rather than this being some personal failing unique to him.
I knew by then that's filmmaking, that things are always going to go wrong and you have to ride that big dog in some way, to get it done.
For Mad Max 2, Miller decided to tap into mythology, with Max himself taking on a kind of mythical status inspired by various different cultures, a reference of sorts to the original film's wide international reach. Miller stated that in Japan, they called it a samurai movie and said, "You must know Kurosawa." I'd never heard of Kurosawa. In France, they said, "Oh, it's a Western on wheels." In Scandinavia, they said, "He's a Viking." And basically, I began to realize that somehow there was something else going on there, that there's a mythology out there, and basically Mad Max was a kind of weird Australian version of that. Mad Max 2 was very influenced by that. Suddenly you saw that he was much more than just a character, that he was indeed a mythological figure, a mini version of one. He's not a great hero, but he has that. Something like that is in him. So it was a little bit more self-conscious in Mad Max 2, not following it religiously, the hero myth, but it was an understanding that that was what was at foot. And so in the sequel, Max does take on a role that goes beyond revenge and comes close to the idea of a myth. He mellows out and behaves a little bit more altruistically. The film released in 1981 was a big success in Australia, doubling the performance of the first film. But internationally, it fared far worse due to a lack of distribution and also some strange meddling. In the US, the film wasn't even marketed as Mad Max 2. It was instead called The Road Warrior, with all references to it being a sequel scrubbed from the promotional materials. Despite the lukewarm reception, Miller continued with Mad Max and had worked out a story for a sequel alongside Terry Hayes, but his commitment on the film wavered after a tragic loss. Byron Kennedy, Miller's first partner in the movie business, died in a helicopter crash in 1983, but Miller ended up deciding to stick with production, later saying there was just a sort of need to do something just to get over the shock and grief of all of that. For Mad Max 3, which he called Beyond Thunderdome, Miller decided he wanted to push it into a different direction, with a much wider plot involving more locations and characters, further developing the wasteland settings. The film ended up matching worldwide Mad Max 2, but performed worse than both of its predecessors in Australia. This was a likely factor in what came next. The dwindling returns and especially the death of Byron left Miller feeling jaded when it came to Mad Max, saying, "I don't remember a lot about making that film because at the time, my partner Byron Kennedy had been killed in a helicopter accident. We'd already committed to do the film, but by the time I finished, I thought I was done with Mad Max." Over the years, people would ask, "You ever want to do another?" And I would say, definitely not.
What's the matter? You don't think God makes mistakes?
This led Miller to have another go at Hollywood with The Witches of Eastwick, his first non-Mad Max theatrical.
The Witches of Eastwick.
Hocus pocus.
The Witches of Eastwick is an adaptation of the 1984 novel of the same name, about a group of women who end up stumbling into forming a witch coven and dealing with machinations of supernatural figure Daryl Van Horn.
This is my bedroom.
Miller's original impression of Hollywood from the making of Roxanne wasn't turned around by Eastwick, saying that initially he went into the project naive with his eyes completely shut, but quickly realized that he had made a mistake, saying, "That's when I hit the full force of Hollywood pathology, with the studio repeatedly trying to nickel and dime him." He recalled the consequences of being modest with his needs at a budget meeting, saying that, "The first budget meeting, I sat down, I said, look, I don't need a trailer. I'm never in my trailer. I'm always with the actors or I'm on set with the crew, so you can save money." Now in Australia, that was a good thing. In Hollywood, that was code for saying, this guy's negotiable on anything. So suddenly, it meant that if I wanted 300 extras for a scene, it was 150. If I needed 3 cameras, it was 2. In fact, he would attempt to quit the film several times as he struggled to make this film in a new environment. But an actor in the film convinced him to stay. Jack held me in there. He said, "Just sit down, lose your emotion, sit down, have a look at the work. If you think the work is good, stick with the film." And he was a great man. I learned more from him than anybody else I think I'd worked for. He was extraordinary. He was extraordinary. The experience was still such a disaster that he took a break from filmmaking for several years until working on Lorenzo's Oil, a story about a medicine of the same name used to treat the disease known as adrenoleukodystrophy, and its development by the Owens family. This is a far more optimistic narrative showing a child being saved from a devastating neurological disease, a far cry from the anarchic violence of the first Mad Max, showing some diversity in Miller's storytelling that only extends over time. Miller's next intended film in 1993 was a sci-fi movie, Contact, an adaptation of the 1985 Carl Sagan novel dealing with extraterrestrial life. But Miller found himself running up against studio meddling in a crisis of ambition, constantly revising the script and insisting it needed more time, which pushed back the production stage more and more, with the film's co-producer saying in an interview that Warner Brothers finally came to the conclusion that George would make a great movie, but it wouldn't be ready until after the millennium. In the same article, actor Jodie Foster was quoted saying, "He's an unbelievably inspirational person and a great filmmaker. He's the kind of director that can make a 2.5-hour movie about an eye blinking, and it would be the most extraordinary, deep, beautiful film, but he's very naive about the business." For Miller's part, though, he said that Warner Brothers had wanted something safer for the film and weren't willing to follow through on his ideas, with their concepts being something more predictable. The film was ultimately passed to Robert Zemeckis, who saw the film to a 1997 completion. From here, Miller made an even bigger pivot than he had with Lorenzo's Oil, making the jump to children's films. This started with him acting as a co-writer and producer for the film Babe. Miller then went on to direct its sequel Babe, Pig in the City, which released in 1998. Pig in the City was seen as a disappointment compared to the original. But interestingly enough, the reason these are really the only films he worked on for the rest of the 90s comes down to him having a hard time figuring out how to get pigs' mouths to move the way he wanted. He would actually consult with director Stanley Kubrick.
Stanley Kubrick had lots and lots of conversations with people on the phone. And back when we were doing Babe, we didn't know how to make, this is pre-digital, didn't know how to make the pig speak. He'd sit and talk for a long, long time and talk about the process. And I knew that he was very, very intrigued about what could be happening. You know, I explained we're trying to make a pig talk, but he was particularly caught up with this, the technology of not cutting on videotape.
Miller was later tapped to continue working with Warner Brothers as a director on a Justice League film in 2007, with Variety at the time describing it as a project they were moving aggressively ahead with, and so keen about it that they were delaying another project, a planned Superman film, in order to realize it. But during the pre-production process, it ended up getting canceled. Given that Batman is one of the major superheroes in the Justice League's pantheon, Christopher Nolan was apparently anxious about the idea of this film releasing while he was still in the process of completing his Batman trilogy, and with the blazing success of The Dark Knight, his feelings were likely a compelling factor in this. The project also didn't get off the ground before the 2008 writer's strike hit, and when the strike was over, the Nolan trilogy was still ongoing, with The Dark Knight Rises releasing in 2012. It's interesting to think about in this crossroads of cinema history, about the different path the DC universe would have taken with George Miller at the helm of a film like Justice League. With Justice League stalled, Miller instead focused on directing 2 more children's films, the Happy Feet films, which were released in 2006 and 2011 respectively, showcasing the lives of a colony of penguins out in Antarctica. Despite this Antarctic children's movie being a world away from the Outback Mature themed Mad Max, there was a crossover in terms of an environmental theme, saying, in Australia, we're very, very aware of the ozone hole, and Antarctica is likely the canary in the coal mine for this stuff, so it sort of had to go in that direction. You can't tell a story about Antarctica and the penguins without giving that dimension. George Miller was also partially inspired by the Lord of the Rings trilogy and Gollum's motion capture performance for this film.
The wonderful cinematographer Andrew Lesney, who shot the Lord of the Ring movies, showed me the first motion capture of Gollum back in the early 2000s. And the moment I saw that, I think it was Andy Serkis doing Gollum at that point. The moment I saw that, I thought, we can make these penguins dance.
George Miller is a fascinating director in the sense that through the years, he never shied away from using special effects in new and surprising ways, not getting stuck on how he used to do things, but always looking for those new pathways to make his projects become a reality. And this would prepare him for the next live-action film after completing Happy Feet 2, marking the end of Miller's dive into children's films and seeing him return to his roots.
And the Oscar goes to... Happy Feet, George Miller.
This is the first Academy Award and fourth nomination for George Miller, previously nominated for writing Lorenzo's Oil and writing...
The fourth Mad Max film, Fury Road, had begun in earnest only 2 years after Beyond Thunderdome in 1987, but it ended up in development hell until the early 2000s.
In fact, the last thing I wanted to do was to tell another Mad Max story. I'd already done 3, and I thought I'd exhausted it, and they're tough films to make. But believe it or not, about 7 years ago, I caught a flight from Los Angeles to Sydney during the night. And I don't know where or how, but the story started to play out in my mind. I got two-thirds of the way through the story, and I said, oh my God, that's a Mad Max story.
From the ashes of this world!
And it took another 18 months to get it onto paper, and we were about to shoot it when the Iraqi war started. The American dollar crashed against the Australian dollar. We were going to be making it with Australian dollars.
This pile of obstacles killed Fury Road and pushed Miller to commit to Happy Feet. But with that franchise completed, he had room to return to the grit and violence of the Outback. But this time it was with a twist. Miller decided to give Fury Road a different edge, a feminist one, saying to Vanity Fair's Katie Rich in an interview, "I've gone from being very male-dominant to being surrounded by magnificent women. I can't help but be a feminist." To this end, he envisioned the character of Furiosa, a warrior woman seeking her lost homeland, and later to rebel against her former ruler and warlord, Immortan Joe, rescuing Joe's enslaved wives in the process who assert their personhood. Furiosa is the film's co-protagonist alongside Max and drives much of the narrative, and this elevated role of women wasn't just confined to the story. Miller reached out to his wife, Margaret, to edit the film, believing having her at the helm would ensure that it didn't look like every other action movie. He also reached out to the feminist writer and activist V, previously known as Eve Ensler, to give a talk on violence against women, especially in war zones, which was a central theme of the plot, contextualizing the story with real-world examples from the Japanese in World War II to the Congo, Bosnia, Afghanistan, and Haiti, as well as cases of trafficking in the US. V said she was blown away by the script and its spotlight on what she called a central issue of our time, and praised Miller as a feminist who included women's experiences in a compelling story that empowered women of many different stripes, giving them agency when a lot of movies fall flat on that promise. Miller also looked to change the direction of Mad Max in another way, the visuals, saying that aesthetics don't die in the apocalypse. He found himself inspired by African townships where he saw beauty even in conditions of intense poverty, reflecting this by seeking out a highly saturated color palette instead of the expected instinct others had of a dulled out tones and what he called a traveling junkyard. And so after a 30-year hiatus, Mad Max was back on the big screen, and the film managed to climb the series out of the pit of a financial decline it faced in the past. It made over $300 million on a $150 million budget, which must have been a good feeling for Miller. But there is a little bit of controversy on whether or not they actually made any money on this film. But still, the film was enough to continue the saga. With Fury Road completed, Miller decided to take another hiatus on the franchise to work on an adaptation of a book called The Djinn in the Nightingale's Eye by writer A.S. Byatt. This adaptation would be known as 3,000 Years of Longing, telling the story of a genie trying to convince the woman who discovers him to make her 3 wishes through telling the stories of his past lives. He presented the film as a kind of ode to storytelling itself, speaking of storytelling as something hardwired, key to our sense of the world, and a marker of our evolution, even if plenty of it isn't actually true.
Across all time and space, we've been hardwired for stories. Stories are the way we make meaning of a very chaotic universe. We have to explain it to ourselves in a way that's at least has some coherence and helps us make our way through the world.
Following this film, Miller had once again found his appetite for the world he created in Mad Max, with the upcoming prequel film Furiosa, a Mad Max saga, which takes place decades before Fury Road. Director George Miller, in an interview in 1996, said, "I see filmmaking as a strange journey. In mythology, the trickster leads you into the forest. Film is, to me, the trickster. I think I can be around 1,000 years and never understand the process." And this mindset is a testament to his intriguing diversity in filmmaking over the course of his career. From the mayhem and violence of Mad Max to the family-friendly film about a dancing penguin, they all share a connection, a fight for civility, and a desperate hold on hope. And instead of the grandstanding and over-explanation to an audience that can occur within many films, both modern and classic, Miller's scripts liken back to the silent era he admires so much, allowing his characters and stories to express themselves in different and sometimes deeper ways. We're the servants of the zeitgeist, and we live in a chaotic world. There is so much information coming at you. We are trying to find resonances out there to create some kind of meaning. Stories are a way of distilling something out of all of that bombardment. They are a way of finding signal in the noise. If you enjoyed this video about director George Miller, be sure to check out our video on Director Westball or any of our other videos in our director series right here.